Okay, hello everyone, Mr. K here again. Talking about brakes today. This is brakes part 2. There is going to be a part 3. I just couldn't quite fit it all into 2 different presentations without, I think, just overwhelming you guys. So this is part 2. You don't have to watch this video. I just threw that up there for when we're in class. It's kind of a, I don't know, icebreaker, something to kind of get you awake for the day. But it's kind of neat if you do watch it. If you don't know about the farm truck dragster, it's kind of fun. You might look it up on YouTube. All right, so we're talking about brake systems again today. And what we're going to talk about today is types of brakes and just the basic maintenance that you do. For those of you that are familiar with brakes, that's going to be changing the pads, changing the shoes, that type of stuff. All right, we're talking about drum versus disc brakes versus electric brakes, parking or emergency brakes, and this common maintenance. Real basic stuff today. But if you haven't heard of it, then it may not be so basic for you, but we're going to walk through it. So if we're in class, I would have you start off on, I'd be leading, I guess, a drum versus disc discussion here. Obviously, since you're watching this video, you're not going to be discussing it, but just ponder for a minute the advantages and disadvantages of each one of these if you've worked on them or if you know anything about them. And 95% of the people are going to say disc is better all the time. Disc is the greatest thing ever made. Disc brakes are just so wonderful. Why do they even have drums? Why do they still exist? They're junk. That's what I hear all the time. Everyone hates drum brakes. We're going to talk about why drum brakes are actually inherently better by design. It's just disc brakes that are mass produced because they're cheap and they dissipate heat a lot better than drum brakes. But drum brakes actually, from a physics standpoint, are actually a better braking system. All right. So as I have with a lot of other presentations, I'm going to start you off with the oldest design first, and then we'll work our way newer. So oldest stuff first are drum brakes, and been used for a long time. From 1900 to 1970, and I say on all 4 wheels, and then used from 1970 through today on just the front wheels. Sometimes other scenarios than that, but that's kind of the general rule. And sometimes they're not used at all. Some cars, I mean, I don't know much about Corvettes, but I would venture to say that, for just as an example, a Corvette probably hasn't seen drum brakes on it at all since maybe the 80s. So maybe early 80s even. So drum brakes are, yes, they're less common than they used to be. However, brand new trucks still have them in the back. A lot of them do. They're quite complex, as you can see from that picture on the right. Here's the big thing about drum brakes. They are they just provide great stopping power. They will just lock a wheel up at a moment's notice with not a whole lot of pressure behind them. And they're robust design. So as with every upside, there's a downside, which I think I have that in. Yeah, here's one big downside. Before I get to that, actually, I'm going to tell you that they're just complex. And when you replace drum brakes, you have to deal with every one of these little pieces that's got an arrow pointing to it, maybe except for the spindle, but otherwise everything else you've got to deal with. Drum brakes are just, there's a lot of little springs and clips and things to deal with. And if you're not used to them, they're not fun. And if you get a spring or a clip backwards, they don't work right. You got to take it all back apart again. So not as easy as disc brakes to work on. Another thing is there's a big drum that rides that covers all this, and it holds heat in, and it holds contaminants in inside of the brake mechanism, so they don't dissipate heat very well. All right, but more advantages: better holding power when you're stopped. So that's why they're used for emergency brakes or parking brakes quite a bit. I think that's the last oh no. And then of course, another downside is they're more difficult to maintain, which we talked about that. There's just a lot of little springs and clips to deal with. So at this point, go ahead and pause my video and watch this one on YouTube, which this is just a 3D animation that shows how drum brakes work. Okay, you should have just watched that drum brakes video. Shows you how drum brakes work. Let's roll on. Okay, as you saw a couple slides ago, there are a ton of parts in drum brakes. You don't have to memorize all those. Don't expect you to know all those. What I do expect you to know for the test are what are the shoes, which are these right here. Those are the parts that wear out. What's the wheel cylinder? This guy, that's what pushes the shoes outward. And what's the drum? And the drum is the big guy that it's kind of like the rotor if it's a disc brake. Okay, that's what it rides on. So that's drums. There's your basic understanding of drums. Take that, set it aside. Disc brakes. Okay, I'm gonna say used from about the 70s through now in all front wheels, and some vehicles have four-wheel disc brakes. They've totally gotten rid of drums. Fewer moving parts, less money. This is a big one. This is the biggest thing to auto manufacturers, I would argue. Better cooling. Okay, hopefully that's obvious why. There's not a drum covering everything. The disc, the braking mechanism is exposed to all the elements, exposed to air, water, whatever it may be. It's gonna, all that heat that builds up is just gonna flow right off of it. But of course, there's always a downside. This gets into a little more physics, but your book will tell you that disc brakes require more than double the amount of pressure from the brake pedal and wheel cylinder to be able to operate and stop the same size vehicle. So they're actually a less efficient braking system when it comes to mechanical power. Take a look at the pad. This pad makes up, how much of the brake rotor? Maybe a sixth of the contact area. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, probably about a sixth. Go back and look at a drum. Look, this drum hugs probably half of the inside of that brake drum. Or I'm sorry, these shoes hug about half of it. So when you get more pad contact area with the drum, it lasts longer. So disc brakes have less pad contact area, lower lifespan. They wear out a little bit faster. Now, because they're a less efficient braking system, they also have less stopping power than drum brakes. And I put cold in there. I added that word because remember, disc brakes shed heat a lot better. And when brakes heat up, whether it be drum or disc brakes, they get something called brake fade. And your brakes don't work anyway on brake fade. So, but for cold, let's say cold stopping power, disc brakes are not as good. So that's why they're not used for a parking brake applications as much. So of course, why are they so popular? The 2 C's, cost and cooling. Okay, they're on motorcycles. Motorcycles have drums too, some of them. Airplanes, big airplanes have disc brakes because those get super hot on landing. They shed heat. All right, how about a disc brake animation? Go ahead and pause my video and watch this video at this time. All right, you should have just watched that video on disc brake animation. Hopefully that gives you a little better idea how they work. Disc brakes don't have quite as many parts, I would argue, but the ones I want you to know for the test are those. Rotor, what spins, this guy. Pads, what you have to replace. Caliper, the guy in green, and the piston in the caliper. Okay. All right, so there's the basics on disc brakes. Set that aside. Let's go to electric brakes. I only have one slide on these, and that's because these aren't used in automotive anywhere I have seen. Perhaps they're used in something automotive related or with an engine or with maybe some sort of truck, but I've never seen them. I've only seen them on trailers. And all I really want you to get out of these is they're basically a drum brake, but they're not powered by hydraulics with a wheel cylinder inside. They're powered by a magnet, electromagnet, and these wires send power into this electromagnet. It activates and it actually grabs the inside of the drum, and then as it grabs it, this arm bends over and rocks up here and spreads the shoes out so they rub on the inside of the drum. So it's similar to the fashion of a regular drum brake, but it's powered by a magnet, electromagnet. And of course, if you're going to power it with electricity, you need something to control that, and that is a brake controller. So if you're going to have these on a trailer, you need some sort of brake controller like this that alters the voltage to it. Same ups and downs as drum brakes, use them in trailers a lot. Okay, we talked about the controller. All right. So if you ever pull a trailer brake apart, some trailers have brakes, it's probably going to look something like that. Parking brakes. Okay, hopefully you all know how to apply a parking brake. It's either the pedal on the far left or a handbrake, right? Typically uses rear drum brakes. And why do we use rear drum brakes? Because they have better holding power when the vehicle's stopped. These are always going to be powered by something other than the system that the standard brakes, the driving brakes use. And that's actually required by law. That's a DOT reg. Your emergency brake or parking brake has to be cable driven or driven by something other than the main system that you'd use when you press the main brake pedal, because it's a backup. And of course, some design or some manufacturers have to be different, and they use a DIH design, which we're going to talk about. All right, parking brakes. There's what your cables are going to look like. If you get under a car with parking brakes, you'll see cables like that running around in places. Here's probably more likely what you'll see. It's going to be, I guess, closer to it. And as those get to be like that, I start dousing those things in WD-40 or some sort of lubricant spray every time I change the oil, because water will seep in there and lock those cables up before you know it. Here's how a typical parking brake design works. You've got your normal drum brakes with your wheel cylinder, nothing's changed there. And then you've got the cable running in from your handbrake or your emergency brake pedal. That cable connects to this big arm, and as you stomp that pedal or pull that handbrake, this cable contracts, the arm moves, the arm then pushes on this push rod, which spreads these brake shoes out against the drum. So again, you're still using the drum brake mechanism, you're just using it mechanically instead of hydraulically. All right. So for those manufacturers that have to be different and they just have to do everything, I guess, be the best they can be, you'll see a drum and hat design. That's what that's called. It's the best of all worlds. It truly is. It's just expensive and hard to maintain. Silverados use this, Yukons, GMC Acadias, even Mercury does it on their Grand Marquis. Just a lot of more expensive vehicles, I guess. You're probably not going to see this on a Geo Metro or something cheap little cars. I don't think you'd see it on a Honda Civic, something like that. But some of the higher end stuff, you start seeing it. Some of the trucks and higher end cars. And this is both. It's a drum brake here inside of a disc brake. And it looks like, here's the cutaway view. You've got a standard disc brake with a rotor and your caliper, and then inside of there, hidden, you've actually got a drum brake, and that is the parking brake. Again, it's the best of all worlds. You get superior holding power with the drum brakes for parking, but you also get superior cooling power with your disc brakes and ease of working on them. Cheap parts, right? The problem is now you're maintaining, for every wheel, you're maintaining 2 sets of brakes and not just one. And these do get expensive. We replaced just the emergency brake system or the parking brake system on a 2011 GMC Acadia recently in class. And it was, I think, $73 for the brakes and the hardware that went with it for just the rear axle there, for this drum and hat design. They're kind of specialized, so they're expensive. Okay, so there's some designs of parking brakes. Now let's talk about how do we maintain this stuff? How do we keep it going? So for disc brakes, basics are brake pads, right? There we go. There's my picture. Okay. And obviously you want your pads to look like this. Okay, that's what they look like when they're new. That would be when they're not only worn out, but then become so worn that the pad is gone and you're down to the steel. That's what they look like. And of course, we've seen that in class with some teachers' vehicles. But what brake pads do is they wear out, as you see in the photo. That's what they should look like. There's another brand new one. They overheat and glaze. Okay, if you pull a brake pad off and it's just so shiny, you can almost see your reflection in it like that. Just really glossy. It's probably glazed over, which means it still works, but it doesn't work very well. Okay, it would be kind of like if you were trying to, I guess if you could imagine replacing your tires on your car with wooden wheels, you can imagine that wood is rock hard or very, very hard and it doesn't grab the concrete very well. If you go out onto the road and try to hit the gas or hit the brakes, you're just going to spin, you're going to slide all around. Or if you even just took the tires off your car and just drove it on the rims, that steel doesn't grip the road very well. That's kind of like the principle here. It's just a real hard material. It's been overheated and it's glazed over. There's a couple fixes for this. You can replace the pads, which is probably your best option. If you really want to save money, you can pull the pads off and you can take a power sander to them and knock that glaze off. Probably not the recommended way, but I've done it and it does work. Okay, while we're here, let's talk about wear indicators on disc brake pads. They often look all a little different. This is just one example of them. The wear indicator is there so that when this pad gets down to almost grinding on the metal, almost to that point, it'll start squealing. There's your wear indicator. That will start dragging the brake rotor and it'll start squealing, and that's when you know you need to replace your brakes real soon or else you're going to look at this. You're going to have that happen. And delaminate at the bottom, that's not real common anymore, but you do see that once in a long while. The glue that holds these brake pads to the backing will actually come loose and this whole this whole pad will just fall off. Okay, this is kind of a neat trick. Go ahead and watch this video at this time. All right, you should have just watched that video. Tells you how to check brake pad condition without jumping under the car. It's kind of neat. Okay, talk more about disc brake maintenance. Caliper slides is another thing that you will see. You need to clean them and lubricate them. Let me back up on that one. I'm not going to pop that up there just yet. These are what allows the caliper to float. Okay, as those brake pads wear out and get thinner, the caliper will actually need to readjust where it sits in regard to the rotor. And it needs to do that by sliding on these slide pin bolts. Okay, which means those need to be clean and they need to be greased on the inside. If they freeze up, let's say if one freezes up, this can't float around like it's supposed to. They can't float around, you're going to wear out one side of the brake pads way more than the other. If only one of these slides freezes up, you end up with a brake pad that's worn unevenly. Okay, another form of caliper slides. This is the Ford style. What you saw was, I would argue, the everything else style. It's the GM style, but probably used by most other manufacturers, something similar to that. Ford does something completely different, at least they did for a long, long time. They still have caliper slides. The caliper still has to float, right? It's just steel on steel. They don't have any kind of pin there. They don't have any kind of bearing, nothing. It's just steel that rides right on the steel. So you really have to make sure that is lubricated correctly, or else these will freeze up and your brakes will just wear one-sided. Now, there's a certain special type of grease, but also don't put too much on. If you put too much of grease on here, as these brakes heat up, that grease can get thin and run out and down and all over your rotor, and your brakes don't work at all. Special type of grease. Why do we need to buy brake grease? Why can't we just use wheel bearing grease? Hopefully in your head, you're thinking, because it's high heat. So brake grease takes a higher temperature to thin out and melt and run, and that allows it to not run down on your brake parts as fast. So if you get cheapo grease or wheel bearing grease, it might warm up here and it might start dripping down here on your pads, and your pads won't stop the car anymore. Got to have that high temperature grease so it doesn't do that. Okay. All right. We're almost done here. Let's talk about drum brake maintenance. It's going to be similar. We're still going to have brake shoes. They're going to need to be replaced, right? There's some bad ones. Okay. There's some new ones. They're going to wear out. They're going to overheat and glaze, and they could delaminate. Same stuff we talked about. Okay. No surprises there. Now, drum brakes can be quite a bit different on where you lubricate them. Remember, drum brakes are more complex, I guess, to work on, more steps. And here's one of those examples. You got to apply brake lubricant to multiple spots, wherever those brake shoes ride. Now, you don't want a whole lot. In fact, this example I threw up here, I think is too much in my book. I think that's actually way too much. You just want a thin film. But anyway, you just need a little bit of grease on these points where they slide. And that way the drums or the shoes won't make squealing noises or creaking noises when you apply them. And also they'll move around correctly. All right. So let's just recap what we did, because we went through a lot of stuff today. Talk about drum, disc, and electric brakes, parking brakes, common brake maintenance, and I gave you some things that are going to be on the quiz. Okay. So on that note, go ahead and jump in and do your assignment on brake systems, part 2. And have a good day.